Welcome to Study Loop.
Okay, so today we're going to look at a problem which basically outlines 6 different characteristics of firms, and then we have to point out whether these characteristics belong to a perfectly competitive firm, a monopolistically competitive firm, whether that firm can be both, or it's neither. Okay, so the way we're going to do the solution is first we'll look at the price and quantity diagrams for a PCF or perfectly competitive firm, an MCF, which is a monopolistically competitive firm. What we're going to look at is certain characteristics such as the marginal revenue, marginal cost, the demand curve, D, and the average total cost. All right, let's dive into it. So first, I'm going to draw the price versus quantity diagrams for each type of firm. And then we can take a look at what for each characteristics, and then we can take a look at whether each characteristic is for PCF or MCF or something else. So here we'll have price. That doesn't seem like a price. I'm going to just extend it a little bit. Okay, price, quantity, this is PCF. This is MCF. All right. So we know how a typical marginal cost and marginal revenue curve is. So we're going to draw it like this. This is MC for marginal cost. This is MR for marginal revenue. Now, even for a monopolistically competitive firm, things are fairly going to remain similar. So this is MC. This is MR. Okay. Now, we know that for a perfectly competitive firm, it operates in an environment where it's a price taker or the demand curve is absolutely horizontal. It's demand curve T. On the other hand, for a monopolistically competitive firm, the demand curve is slightly downward sloping or generally downward sloping. Why? Well, we'll come to that answer a little bit later, but you know that a monopolistic competitive firm, well, as the name suggests, has a monopoly. So it can charge higher prices for the same quantity. So that is why this curve is downward sloping, right? Now we can also draw the average total cost curve. Now we know that for a perfectly competitive firm in equilibrium, the average total cost curve will basically pass through this point. Why? I'll explain that in a moment. And for a monopolistically competitive firm which has this marginal revenue, let's say that it has an ATC which goes through here. So, these points have to basically align. So yeah. Okay. So we can see that at the most optimum point for a firm to operate is when its marginal cost equals its marginal revenue. That is its most optimal point because it's the profit maximizing or the loss minimizing quantity. We'll take a look here. Why is that so? So let's just first pronounce price P and small q. Similarly for this guy, it's here, right? It should be producing at this price and quantity. Price P, quantity Q. Now, why would a firm always operate here? Well, because if a firm has marginal revenue curve like this, right, its average total cost is basically lower than the marginal revenue, which means that, well, it's making more money for the same quantity it's selling, so it's in profit, right? However, if a new firm enters the market, this firm has a pressure to lower its price because the other firm starts selling at lower price, so it has to go like this way. And similarly, if a firm is operating here, it's making a loss, it doesn't make sense for the firm to operate, so it'll likely push the prices up so that it can actually survive in the market. So at the end of the day, the firms produce at this point where obviously the marginal cost curve, the marginal revenue curve, marginal cost curve intersect, right? The demand curve also is at this point, as well as the average total cost. On the other hand, for a monopolistically competitive firm, well, it has some monopoly, right? So it can charge higher prices to its consumers for supplying the same quantity, which is like roughly at, well, these 2 points. This is like the minimum point, right? So this goes here. So it's actually selling at a price premium that is above the most optimum point that it could operate at for the same price and quantity. But we also see that, well, the average cost curve is actually here intersecting the marginal cost. Well, yeah, I should also name this as ATC. And it's like, okay, I can produce here, I'll be selling a greater quantity, but it doesn't make actually sense for me because, well, I'll be paying a lower price. That's why the firm might choose to produce here instead, while it should have been producing here because this is the most efficient point for its production. And similarly, we can say that, well, why would it also choose to produce here in a similar fashion to a perfectly competitive firm if it has a marginal revenue like above the cost, it has a profit, so it can choose to produce more, but eventually be pressured because, well, even though it's monopolistically competitive firm, right? So it has some competition present, which means that there are some price pressures that come in. So it'll have similar price pressures in both directions, and we'll choose to produce here. So we now have the setup for the MCF and the PCF. Now let's take a look at each of those different characteristics, right? So the first characteristic is it has a differentiated product compared to its competitors. Now we know that, okay, first let's just write down a differentiated product compared to competitors, right? So we know that a perfectly competitive firm, in fact, sells products that are identical to other firms. So there's no way it's going to be a perfectly competitive firm. But we know that a monopolistic competitive firm does sell products that are slightly different from its competitors. For example, books, right? Book and econ by different authors might sell at different prices. So that's clearly a monopolistically competitive firm. CF. Now, what does the second characteristic say? Well, here's a firm that is operating at a point where the marginal revenue is less than the price that it's selling. Here we can clearly see that the marginal revenue in fact equals the price. So there is no way it's a perfectly competitive firm. However, here we can clearly see that the price at which this firm is operating at is above the marginal revenue. So this is also a perfectly competitive firm. No, it's a monopolistic competitive firm. Sorry. What does characteristic C say? Well, it says that long run, long run economic profit is greater than 0. So for a perfectly competitive firm, it has to produce here, because this is in fact the point at which it produces the profit maximizing quantity, but not necessarily economic profit, because if it chooses to produce at some other point, it has competitors and they will push its production and pricing to the most optimal point. So it doesn't earn an economic profit. So it's not a PCF. On the other hand, an MCF, well, you might say, well, it is selling at a point that's higher than the price that it should be selling. But there's one thing to remember, that there are firms in competition in some way to a monopolistic competitive firm as well, which is pushing uh, it to the most optimum point. So in fact, it also does not make uh, an economic profit in the long run. So it's neither. Now, what does characteristic D say? Well, it says that it is producing at a point where the average total cost is minimum. We can see quite clearly that yes, for PCF, it is at a point where the minimum cost is there. So ATC means it's a PCF. Now for the MCF, we might want to say, well, it does actually produce this point as well, which is in fact true. Why? Well, you can see that this is like the most minimum cost, but here it has to pay higher prices. So it's 5, sorry, 3. E, what does characteristic E say? Well, it's a firm where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. You can see that for both firms, indeed, the marginal revenue is actually equaling the marginal cost. So we see this point and then see this point. So MR equals MC, it's true for both. Now finally, for characteristic F, it says that, well, it's a firm that's producing at prices higher than the marginal cost. Here, we see that the perfectly competitive firm does in fact produce at the price level where the marginal cost equals the price. However, an MCF is indeed operating at a point where the marginal cost is less than the prices, or the price is greater than the marginal cost. So it's clearly an MCF. Great. All right. So that's our problem. I hope this helps you out understanding the concepts and how we work through. And yeah, thank you. Looking forward to see you next time.